In our study of the Kena Upanishad, we are fast approaching the final conclusion of the text, which teaches us how we are to attain to the divine, the consciousness, and the immortality of the divine. In understanding this last portion, where we are following Sri Aurobindo's commentary, it is useful to remind us ourselves of a few key ideas. When the Kena, or generally the Veda, speaks of worlds, the world of Brahman, the world of immortality, the world of the gods, they mean by that not separate spaces or domains, but states of consciousness. States which are, being cosmic, available everywhere, equally available to us here in our present embodied life. Where is the Satchidananda? It is a state of consciousness. The consciousness itself is the very foundation of this cosmos and is therefore present everywhere. Right here, right now, within us, as much as in all things outside us. So to live in immortality is not for them a withdrawal from the mortal life in the body into some other state of consciousness outside the body. It is for them a shift here itself into a consciousness which is immortal, abandoning the consciousness which is mortal, limited, inferior, ignorant, to rise into a consciousness which is liberated, complete, immortal, but here. And this has been affirmed before explicitly in this text, where at the conclusion of the second chapter it said, if here one comes not to that knowledge, then great is the perdition. But if here one comes to that knowledge, then one truly is. And so the here is in the embodied material life and consciousness. This is one important idea. The second is the reference to the gods, as distinct from the reference to the self. The self is the oneness, infinite, the foundation of all. There is nothing other than self. But self is not only oneness, it is equally multiplicity in which that oneness can express itself, and a whole hierarchy of multiplicities, successively more distant, more limited, and so on. But in the first turn of the self to manifest itself, it takes up principles, powers, aspects through which to form all the infinite multiplicity. These are the gods. In the text of the Veda, their role is close to the oneness of the self, leaning out in a specific function. One which holds the aspect of the infinity, one which pushes forward with power to develop, to unfold, one which holds the aspect of knowledge, light, and so on. And so they have very specific effects, functions, and although originating immediately from the self, their functions now extend all the way down to the lower gradations of the hierarchies of working, of forms, and of the world, where increasingly their function is as if clouded or lost in the densification of appearances and of forms, until in the most material physical world, it's as if their working is concealed, hidden behind the forms. But they're still there. Their own power working not only is hidden, but as if has forgotten or has lost its continuity with the origin in the self. So as we come lower, we can see the same deities operating in less freedom, greater limitation, until in the domain of material form, it is as if they're lost and bound and unable to be found. In the Veda, this idea is used with great power in many images. There are images of the riches of the gods, which are the spiritual powers which are now lost underground or in the caverns, in the caves, representing these powers now bound inside matter or in conscience. But they're still there. They're still the same powers, but bound here. And the struggle of the higher gods in their freer working is to somehow free their treasury which has been stolen and hidden and bound in the darkness. And the means by which they find it through the power of the intuition and so on is described. This is one of the powerful images. There are other images also, but in the subsequent development of the vocabulary of the Veda, particularly in the later Upanishadic phase and in the Puranic phase, we see the gods almost as if projections of humans with some special capacity. They seem to belong to the domain of the mind, beings almost of the mental world, even if of a higher range of mind. But they are so individualized, so human-like, because they've forgotten their origin and their supporting oneness which they are meant to express. Now here in the Kena, similarly, the gods are seen of a slightly lower grade. They've forgotten their oneness. And so in the story, or the parable of the gods, they have to be awakened and reminded of their source, so that they realize that their power is not theirs, but belongs to the Lord, and then turn and submit to the Lord. This image, more specifically belonging to the Upanishadic period, is also followed through in the Puranic stories, where the gods battling the demons often find themselves unable to, or they find themselves losing, and so they have to go to the higher source, the highest aspects of the deity, and ask for help from there. Here in this text, the gods are primarily the psychological workings in the cosmos, in the domain of the mind, life, and even in part in the material formative process of Agni. So Indra as mind, Vayu as life force, and Agni as the power which creates the physical form and presides over the working. Indra also presiding over the senses in matter. These gods are the ones who are able to approach to the self when they're shown that their power is insufficient. So here we find a whole dominant description of the gods being awakened. And then there is the self. Things of the gods and things of the self. In the vocabulary in Sanskrit, adhidaivatam and adhyatmam. Adhi, of the nature of, daiva, gods. Again, we have mentioned before, it's a bad translation to say gods. Div, the root is light. So beings of light, light beings. The things to do with the light beings who preside over the working in the universe, that's adhidaivam. And then adhyatman, of the nature of Atman, of the self. immediately comes to mind in the Vedic tradition the three levels on which we experience the reality. At the highest, it is at the level of the self, seen from and from the perspective of the self, always on the basis of oneness. In between, Adhidaivam, the domain of the powers, the gods, as they preside over the cosmic working, or at a lesser level, as they have lost their oneness with the self, but are still operating to run the cosmos. But at the most material, Adhibhautik, of the nature of the Bhuta, and the Bhuta here are the Pancha Bhuta, the five elemental states or conditions, which are the basis of formation of stable form and appearance. So there are three domains. The domains where form is constructed out of the working of the five elemental states of power, of energy, of consciousness. There is a construction. Nothing here is real in itself. It is built up by a process of the five elements. So this is the domain adhibhautik, the domain of form, matter, and the lower realm of ignorance. Adhidaivik, the intermediate domain of the beings of light, we can see from their lower working to their higher working and station. And finally, the adhyatmik of the Atman, highest. So in the two verses which we are now looking at, these two words are coming up. In Sri Aurobindo's translation, now this is the indication of, as in this flash of the lightning upon us, or as in this falling of the eyelids, so in that which is of the gods. And the word here, in that which is of the gods, is iti adhidaivatam. Thus, of the nature of gods, of the nature of light beings, literally translated. And this has to do with all the things in us which are run by light beings, gods, universal powers. And what is it in us which is being run by the universal working? Everything that moves, everything that has form, everything that has force, anything that can be distinguished as separate belongs to that domain. In other words, we will say nature in a more modern vocabulary. All of our nature is this working of the gods. And all upon this nature, this process of a divine working, the principle behind the gods being brought down, settling, working, awakening the gods, teaching them now to yield to a higher working, breaking out of their narrow limitation, uniting with the cosmic working, and thence beyond to the source. This is the transformation of human nature. The second movement is of that which is not of the gods, not of nature. And what is that? The pure essential consciousness, the self, or its limited reflection in us. So, verse 5, then in that which is of the self. And the word here is atha adhyatmam yadetad gacchati iva. Atha, thus, adhyatmam, of the self or towards the self. This yadetad gacchati, moves or goes, iva, thus. Sri Aurobindo translates this simply as then in that which is of the self. Now, in the Sanskrit, there is a nuance. When you say adhyatma, of the Atman, adhi has a particular sense of moving towards or leaning towards. And so adhyatma is towards self, towards Atman. The word is loosely again translated in English as spiritual. Adhyatma is spiritual. But the English word spiritual does not have the same sense. Adhyatma has the sense of leaning, turning, moving, even flowing towards self. So here when we read this, Atha adhyatmam. Thus, towards the self, this moves, gachati, in this manner. In the same manner as happens in nature, turning towards, thus towards the self, it moves. What moves? And Sri Aurobindo's translation, as the motion of this mind seems to attain to that. You see, there's this whole sense of a movement, which is very important because it captures the nature of the yoga. The awakening of the consciousness has a leaning, turning, and then a kind of a flowing towards the self. Some part of the mind. Which part of the mind? Remember, we go back to the second chapter of the Kena, where it asked us to dwell on two things: that of it which is you, that of it which is in the gods. This thou hast to think out. So you're supposed to concentrate on that of the divine which is in the gods, on that of the divine which is you. Which part of you? And you dwell on it. Your mind goes inward or leans into some kind of an essentiality of itself, turning to the self. And so it is this, as the motion of this mind seems to attain to that. And by it afterwards, after this movement, by it afterwards, the will in the thought continually remembers it. So seems to attain to that. It is not really, it's the closest the mind can go, but doesn't really reach that, but seems to experience something of that as far as the mind can. And then it comes back, it cannot stay. But the mind remembers, and in the remembrance, something builds and something grows. And so we have seen already in Sri Aurobindo's commentary last time that we read, the mind seems to go to that, to attain to it. It is lifted out of itself into something beyond. And although it falls back, still, by the mind, the will of knowledge and the mental thought continually and at last continuously remembers that into which it has entered. We discussed last time the importance of this movement of remembrance. And here, in the particular usage of the will in the mind or will in the thought, sankalpa, the word used is sankalpa in Sanskrit. Now, sankalpa has again a very special sense. Loosely translated in English, it is determination, willing, intending, or deciding with a force of will that you do not let go. You will say, I make a sankalpa. It's almost like a promise, a commitment, an oath, but a commitment which is sticking and never let go. And so you can translate it as a determination. So the will in the thought continually remembers it. The word of the will in the thought here is in Sanskrit sankalpa. And you will see the importance that it gives to it. Having experienced something in the approach to the self and having returned from that, perhaps repeatedly, something in us seems to awaken. And a part of the mind as if feels this is so much more important. This is perhaps the most important. And it gathers the whole of the being and commits itself to this. And it is this movement of a self-commitment which is being described here, which he translates as, at last continually remembers that into which it has entered. And this is, of course, the highest the mind goes. On this, the self, through the mind, seizes and repeatedly dwells. And so doing, it is finally caught up into it, and at last able to dwell securely in that transcendence. So as the mind rises to the highest it can, there is the presence of the self which dawns and merges or supports the mind and takes it into itself. Your consciousness transcends its limitation and the limitation of the mind. And this is what we last read, which we will dwell upon now in greater detail. It transcends the mind. It transcends its own mental individualization of the being, that which it now knows as itself. It ascends and takes foundation in the self of all. Edge where the consciousness goes beyond the mind's limitation, it also becomes free of this particular experience we have of a mental individualization of the being. What this is suggesting is that it is the same self which had taken on this appearance, or as if projected itself into this poise of mind self-aware. And it is now liberated from this limitation which it knew to be itself as this individualized, narrow person. The way of self-inquiry is based on this, on the idea that if you pursue your sense of I back to its source, you will find it merges back into the self, which is the only true and whole consciousness. Your mind's self-consciousness or self-awareness is only a tail end or a limited projection of that. And so this happens, and it ascends and takes foundation in the self of all. So far, it was the self of me and mind, which as it transcends this limitation of individualization, what is the self it experiences? The self which is the same self as all, of all. But there are two sides to this. Takes foundation in the self of all, and second, in the status of self-joyous infinity, which is the supreme manifestation of the self. Remember, it is the self which is manifesting as everything finally. But what is its highest poise it can take, which you can experience as self manifested? And the supreme poise of the self, he says, is the self-joyous infinity. This is another way of saying the Satchidananda. The infinity, which is utterly self, conscious of itself, and blissfully conscious of itself. Bliss, which is consciousness, which is existence infinitely. So this poise is the self-joyous infinity. The Satchidananda is what is being described, but also its aspect of infinity before it leans to manifest to become the whole universe. On the edge of that is this infinite bliss, which is self. The idea behind this from a philosophical perspective is when you go back all the way to the one, to the immersion in that is beyond all conception, beyond all limitation of experience. That is unexperienceable, unknowable even. And yet, it can know itself. And when it knows itself in its highest poise, it is this Sat Chit Ananda. It can also know itself in limitation. And as it knows itself in limitations infinitely diverse, we have the experience of the universe. So the highest poise at which you can experience that in the universe is Satchidananda. Beyond that, you can go and lose yourself in immersion into something which is indescribable, unknowable, but in which one can merge entirely. But this poise, which is this highest status of self-joyous infinity, is the supreme manifestation. This is the transcendent immortality. This is the spiritual existence which the Upanishads declare to be the goal of man, and by which we pass out of the mortal state into the heaven of the spirit. This mortal state, this consciousness in which we live, where our consciousness itself is limited and feels itself bound in birth and death. It is a finite life which dies. That's the feeling I have. As if one day I will die, one day I was born. It starts here and it ends somewhere. And this is an illusion, an error, a partial, superficial, limited expression. The true consciousness is immortal, and it is we are meant to live in that here, including. It's not that you live only here. When you live in this consciousness of the self joyous infinity, having attained to it here in the physical life, you live in it permanently. You may shed the body, you still continue to live in it. You may wander across the different worlds, ascend, descend, play around, explore all the infinities of worlds, but you still live in its self joyous infinity. And when you take on a new body, you still live in its self joyous infinity. It is this state which is described as the goal of man and the living in the heaven of the spirit, which in the earlier text, in the earlier part of the text, when they repeatedly, the Kena said that, know that and not this. And in the verse, if here one comes to that knowledge, then one truly is. If here one comes not to that knowledge, then great is the perdition. The wise distinguish that in all kinds of becomings. You experience that in all the becomings, all the realms across the whole cosmos. And they pass forward from this world and become immortal. This world being the world of ignorance into the world of immortality. Now, at this point, Sri Aurobindo must pause before continuing with the text itself, because there is a problem with the modern thought and modern understanding of this state of consciousness. Sri Aurobindo has to deal with it. What then happens to the gods and the cosmos? And all that the Lord develops in his being, because all this is his being that he has manifested. Does it not all disappear when you are merged in this oneness? Is not the transfiguration of the gods even a mere secondary state through which we pass towards that culmination and which drops away from us as soon as we reach it? So thus would be the thinking, and is in fact the teaching in many existing traditions, that all of these are stages, steps, to that last step where you immerse in the Satchidananda out of this, withdrawing from this. And with it, the disappearance of the gods and the cosmos. Does not the Lord, and with the disappearance of the gods and the cosmos, does not the Lord too, the status of the divine as the Lord of the whole cosmos, even that is an inferior status against that absolute into which everything can merge, of which this is an expression. The master consciousness. Does not the Lord too, the master consciousness, disappear so that nothing is left but the one pure, indeterminate existence, self-blissful in an eternal inaction and non-creation? If we were to so withdraw, where would you withdraw into? Out of the creation, out of the movement, out of the action, into something which is still non-moving, against which there is no movement, no manifestation. Such was the conclusion of the later Vedanta in its extreme monistic form. And such was the sense which it tried to read into all the Upanishads. Now, this is extremely important, because only when coming from an authority such as Sri Aurobindo can we take it for what it is. Otherwise, you go to all the authorities commonly known and they will all tell you, yes, it is a withdrawal into oneness which is static. But Sri Aurobindo says, no, this is the interpretation of the later Vedanta. It is not so in the original. And why has it been so? because of the extreme monistic form, the extreme exaggerated immersion into oneness which they set as their goal, defined the nature of the goal as immersion in oneness without multiplicity. By defining it, then naturally the journey of their experience settled into that alone. And having accepted that as the true realization and liberation, they tried to read this meaning into the text of the Isha Upanishad or the Kena or most of the early Upanishads and even into the Veda. Such was the conclusion of the later Vedanta in its extreme monistic form, and such was the sense which it tried to read into all the Upanishads. But it must be recognized that in the language, whether of the Isha or the Kena Upanishad, there is absolutely nothing, not even a shade or a nuance pointing to it. So if this was the intention, then in the text itself there would be things pointing to the fact that in the immersion everything is dissolved. Nothing like that explicitly stated, nothing like that even hinted at. Rather, just as we saw a moment ago, most of the verses speak of here, affirming here, in life, and so on. If we want to find it there, we have to put it in by force. For the actual language used favors instead the conclusion of other Vedantic systems, which considered the goal to be the eternal joy of the soul in a Brahma Loka, a world of Brahman, or world of the Brahman in which it is one with the infinite existence, and yet in a sense still a soul able to enjoy differentiation in the oneness. So he says we have to put it in by force if you want to find it there. In the commentary Sri Aurobindo has of the Isha Upanishad, the first verse, which goes, all this is for the habitation of the Lord, Isha Vasyam Idam Sarvam. And Sri Aurobindo translates as Vasyam as habitation and explains that the purpose of habitation, why do you inhabit the house? Why do you put on clothes? Because you want to possess, because you want to enjoy. So the purpose of this inhabitation by the Lord in the universe is for the purpose of possession and enjoyment. But the traditional lineage of Adi Shankaracharya takes it in a different way. In his commentary, he uses the word vasyam in the sense of clothed, like a garment, like a covering. And this clothing, Sri Aurobindo's commentary, I read from there, the footnote. There are three possible senses of vasyam: to be clothed, to be worn as a garment, or to be inhabited. The first, to be clothed, is the ordinarily accepted meaning. Shankara explains it in this significance, that we must lose the sense of this unreal objective universe in the sole perception of the pure Brahman. So explained, the first line becomes a contradiction of the whole thought of the Upanishad, which teaches the reconciliation by the perception of essential unity of the apparently incompatible opposites, God and world, renunciation and enjoyment, action and internal freedom, the one and many, being and becoming, ignorance, the becoming and the non-becoming, life on earth and beyond, and the supreme immortality. All these, the Upanishad is trying to reconcile and unify. And yet in the very first verse, the translation of Shankara will say, you have to clothe it so that you have to recognize it as a clothing to be discarded, so you can separate the unreal from that which is real. So Sri Aurobindo says, the images of the world either as a garment or as a dwelling place for the informing and governing spirit. The latter significance agrees better with the thought of the Upanishad. So he similarly comments on many key words of translation: karma, action, and Shankara has to translate it as ritual, Whereas the deeper sense or the common sense of the word will be action in the universe, which is discussed in the second verse, where it says, where doing verily works in this world, one should wish to live 100 years. And Shankara translates the works, the karma here, as the rituals by which you will get disentangled from the illusion and so on. So it's obvious that the meaning is brought in by force and is inconsistent with the overall theme and direction of the text. And the same happens in the commentaries on the Kena. If you look on the internet and read some of the commentaries, they can be quite surprising. And when you compare it with Sri Aurobindo's translation, the whole meaning of it is so different, so much more profound and complete. So here we look at this deeper sense. The actual language used favors instead the conclusion of other Vedantic systems. And one of the more prominent ones is still the approach of Madhvacharya, which, again quoting from the Veda, declares all this verily is Brahman. Contrasting with Shankara's declaration that Brahman is the truth and world is illusion. Brahma Satyam Jagad Mithya. Whereas the quotation from the Veda is Sarvam Khalu Idam Brahman. All this verily is Brahman. Now, this is not Brahman entirely. This is part, aspect, or some representation or expression of Brahman, but it is Brahman. And if you wish to know Brahman, and you say the only Brahman you can know is the oneness of Brahman in which there are no forms and multiplicities. In saying that, you have defined Brahman separate from all the multiplicity. What happens to the multiplicity? You have a problem, because Brahman by definition is everything, all inclusive. So if multiplicity does not include Brahman, then multiplicity has to be unreal, illusion, imagination, fantasy, which does not exist, and so you have to get free of it. But if it does not exist, what's the point of getting free? How do you get trapped into something which does not exist? How do you get free from something which does not exist? The whole problem of Maya illusionism is this, that ultimately you realize the self was always free, is still free, and yet there is some kind of a Maya which is entrapping it. And there are all kinds of internal philosophical contradictions, which in the formulation of the philosophy are ignored or bypassed in a kind of a constructed logic. If Brahman is by definition all, then it includes not only the oneness, but also the multiplicity. The problem is the experience of multiplicity in separation from oneness. And at that point, your perception of the multiplicity is illusory. So Mother explains it in this way. She says, the world is not an illusion, but the way we perceive it is an illusion. And to get out of that illusion is to see the world as it truly is, as form and manifestation of Brahman, of Satchidananda, as form and body of God, if we had to put it in very practical terms. You look at the universe, and it is one gigantic energy of God whirling to create as if body and form on so many levels, just as our being is not only physical body, but vital body, mental body, and higher gradations. So the universe is not only physical realm, but all the higher gradations which form the unity or totality of divine being. To see it in terms of pieces and fragments only is your error or illusion. To see the multiplicity as an expression of the underlying oneness which is right here, hidden behind the multiplicity, that would be the true seeing. To see it in its entirety, from the most material to the highest essential spirit, to see it all as Brahman, that would be the fullness of the experience of Brahman. But it means that here in this world we should experience the oneness which we experience there. And we must experience it here in a manner that it is revealed. We see it, feel it, engage with it in and through all things which appear to be at the moment separate and divided. So recall our discussion right at the beginning when we spoke of the gods being bound and hidden. The process then of the yoga is gradually to draw them out, to bring them forward, to reveal, to expose that which is bound, hidden, or even sleeping. If you see nature's processes, this is what happens. You take a stone, flint stone, rub it against another flint stone, and there's a flash of fire. From the Vedic perspective, we would say Agni, which is the creator of the forms, was already hiding inside. In the act of rubbing, in the friction of two forces, he was forced to express himself momentarily. He was revealed momentarily. But if this momentary revelation can be made more and more frequent and then even permanent, then we see Agni working as a flame or through the flame. The whole process of evolution is nothing but the gods now asleep or bound, gradually awakening and working and organizing themselves to express more and more directly. Here in the human being, they have become the most conscious, the most awakened. They are actually self-conscious. When they have a victory, when they have an attainment, then they say, we have won. We are so great. And it is at that point that the Kena describes how the divine says, now you're ready for the next step of awakening. So he appears as this demon. And the gods cannot make out what is this presence. And so they're forced to recognize who it is. And the passage, the one who links them to the higher realization, is the Divine Mother, Uma Haimavati in the text. It is she who teaches Indra, the mind, that was the Brahman. And it is his power that is yours. It is his victory that is your victory. And so our consciousness now awakened, the gods struggling, awakening in us, ready now for the next step, are challenged by the divine presence appearing and helped now to awaken by the mediating power, which is the Divine Mother, the Divine Shakti. And then the gods opening to the oneness still continue to work as gods, but no more as separate ego-centered powers, but as conscious, spontaneous expressions of the One. So our mind, our life, even our body, experiences deep unity and immersion in oneness while participating in the play of the multiplicity. Meanwhile, our self recognizes that I lose or find my oneness, my awakening in the same one who is the Lord, the one self of all, living in the Satchidananda and sharing in the play as conscious participants. So this conclusion of the Vedic with the other Vedantic systems, which considered the goal to be the eternal joy of the soul in a Brahmaloka or a world of the Brahman. And this is Brahmaloka. When you experience everything as Brahman and as expression of Brahman revealed, no more concealed, no more hidden. The eternal joy of the soul in a world of the Brahman in which it is one with the infinite existence, and yet in a sense still a soul able to enjoy differentiation in the oneness. And so in the essential consciousness, the soul unites with the infinite existence. The nature, similarly awakened and transformed, shares in all its experiences in the underlying sense of oneness. And there is a double liberation. Now this point is extremely important. Verse 4, which we read, is the liberation of the gods, transfiguration of the gods. Verse 5 is the liberation of the self. Both undergo a liberation and transformation. It is this which leads to divine life. If only the self was liberated and nature is what it was, ignorant, bound, limited, dark, a liberated consciousness would experience the world through this broken, incapable, dark instrument and say, world is domain of suffering, unchangeable, to be withdrawn from or to be abandoned or to be discarded as illusion. But when nature itself awakens to her divinity and relates to the divinity, you, the inhabiting consciousness, can experience the world through this liberated nature and experience the underlying divinity of the world. And so you have the life itself and the ability to engage with life from the liberated consciousness. Life itself becomes divine or divinized, transformed. So the being one with the infinite existence, yet in a sense, still a soul able to enjoy differentiation in the oneness. This is the goal, to be in this eternal joy in the world of Brahman. The next verse then highlights this aspect. What happens when this liberation is complete? Verse 6. I read the translation. The name of that is that delight. As that delight, one should follow after it. He who so knows that, towards him verily all existences yearn. Sri Aurobindo's commentary. In the next verse, we have the culmination of the teaching of the Upanishad, the result of the great transcendence which it has been setting forth, and afterwards the description of the immortality to which the souls of knowledge attain when they pass beyond the mortal status. It declares that Brahman is in its nature that delight, tadvanam. Vana is the Vedic word for delight or delightful, and tadvanam means therefore the transcendent delight, that delight, not this. You see, the problem with, even in English, when you use the word delight, you will find, oh, that music was such a delightful experience. Oh, the time we spent was such a great delight. Well, there are many delights, like there are many loves. I love my dog, I love this food, but there is something which is of a divine love. There's a divine delight. So specifically it says that delight, tadvanam, the transcendent delight, the all blissful ananda, of which the Taittiriya Upanishad speaks as the highest Brahman, from which all existences are born, by which all existences live and increase, and into which all existences arrive in their passing out of death and birth. It's not in their passing out of death. You pass out of death, well, you're still in a different state of consciousness. All you did was drop out from the gross physical into the subtle, vital, or mental domain. But you're still bound to domain of death, ignorance, limitation, termination, beginning. To be free of death and birth is that state of consciousness in which you have transcended. At that point, you can take on a body, discard a body, wander all over, but you are free even while in the body. So it is this poise which he is describing. It is as this transcendent delight that the Brahman must be worshipped and sought. It is this beatitude, therefore, which is meant by the immortality of the Upanishads. And what will be the result of knowing and possessing Brahman as delight, that he discusses next. But all of this we will review in greater detail for all the fine nuances and important suggestions which it conveys of the nature of that realization and that living. Even the reference to the Taittiriya and so on. In what way the delight is the origin of us? In what way that delight sustains and nourishes us? In what way we are always moving towards that? All of these are very important truths of our existence, which as we explore and become conscious of in ourselves, allows for the nature of the journey itself to become more spontaneous and true. The recognition is that the driving force within us of the whole evolution and yearning for the divine was the delight. Even when we were wandering in life looking for normal experiences of growth to become stronger, more intelligent, more capable, more powerful, more rich, more famous, more loved, whatever it is you chase after. The driving force which makes that growth possible is this underlying delight secretly. How and in what way it awakening leads us to the highest growth, all of these things we will discuss in the next session, which will be after a gap of 3 weeks. We will continue this in April, the Friday class on the 6th and the Sunday class on the 8th. In between, I will be out of station. For those who are interested, we will continue to show some videos of other programs or talks to keep the mood of the study going. And for now, we will hold this idea in ourselves and remain for a while in concentration, in immersion in this. The actual language used favors the conclusion of the other Vedantic systems, which considered the goal to be the eternal joy of the soul in a Brahma Loka or world of the Brahman, in which it is one with the infinite existence, and yet, in a sense, still a soul able to enjoy differentiation in the oneness. The result of the great transcendence, which it has been setting forth, the description of the immortality to which the souls of knowledge attain. It declares Brahman is in its nature that delight, the transcendent delight, the all blissful Ananda, the highest Brahman from which all existences are born, by which all existences live and increase, and into which all existences arrive in their passing out of death and birth. It is in this transcendent delight that the Brahman must be worshipped and sought. Verse 6, the name of that is that delight. As that delight, one should follow after it. He who so knows that, towards him verily all existences yearn.